We have a great lineup of speakers to present this new research this morning, and I'm going to introduce all of them, and then they will each speak in turn, and we'll have some time for your questions and comments after they're finished. First, I'm really excited to announce that we have with us Dr. Claire Lucas, who's a Senior Advisor for Public-Private Partnerships in the Office of Innovation and Development Alliance at USAID. In this role, Claire is leading the agency's effort to expand the creation and implementation of strategic public-private partnerships and to facilitate the agency's collaboration with the private sector to achieve its development and U.S. foreign policy objectives. Claire is an international development expert. She's a coalition builder, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and she's had several leadership positions at the World Bank and has worked for the Pan American Health Organization, the Harvard Institute for Development, and several consulting firms. Following Claire will be Stephen O'Connell, who is USAID's chief economist. In this role, he provides expert advice to agency leadership and staff on economic growth. He's responsible for keeping USAID's economists on the cutting edge of ideas in development economics and supporting their use of analytical tools best suited to the agency's mission. Stephen also is a professor of economics at Swarthmore College. Much of his career has been spent working and advising on macroeconomic policy and economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa. Then from the Williams Institute, we have Lee Badgett, who's our distinguished scholar here, and she's also director of the Center for Public and Policy Administration at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, as well as a professor of economics. She studies family policy issues and labor market discrimination based on sexual orientation, race, and gender, and is author of When Gay People Get Married, What Happens When Societies Legalize Same-Sex Marriage, and Money's Myths and Change, The Economic Lives of Lesbians and Gay Men. Last but definitely not least, calling in from the Netherlands, we have Kees Valdijk, who's the inaugural chair of comparative sexual orientation law at Leiden Law School in the Netherlands. In the spring of 2014, we were really honored to have Kees with us as the Williams Institute McDonald Wright Chair of Law, where he taught a course on comparative sexual orientation law. He's a distinguished LGBT legal scholar, best known for comparative law projects focusing on LGBT legal rights, the legal recognition of same-sex couples, and anti-discrimination protections. So those are our speakers, and we'll now hear from Dr. Claire Lucas.
Great. Thanks so much, Brad, and thank you for that great introduction. Welcome, everybody. USAID is very excited about this report, and we'd really like to thank the Williams Institute for producing this report. It's very thoughtful, it's very strategic, and we would also like to thank them for their partnership with USAID's Global Development Lab, in particular the LGBT Global Development Partnership. Just a little bit about this initiative. We're undertaking 13 research reports and working in 15 different countries. We're strengthening LGBT civil society organizations via subgrants and media training. We're training LGBT leaders in how to participate in democratic processes, and we are strengthening LGBT entrepreneurship. I'd like to give a shout out to our other partners besides Williams. All of these folks are on the phone today, and this includes the Swedish International Development Agency, SIDA, the Australia Lesbian Foundation for Justice, the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, the Victory Institute, and Olivia Companies. Well, I'm not going to get into the report findings because we have the experts who actually wrote the report with us today. This report is already having impact. The powerful message that LGBT rights and GDP are linked is being transmitted, and that's very, very powerful. By linking discrimination against LGBT individuals to a country's economic well-being, the issue of bigotry is not just felt and understood by those who are LGBT, but this discrimination becomes a factor for everybody who cares about the future growth of their country. Policymakers, practitioners, government officials, and civil society leaders and businesses. So I'd like to turn the floor back over to Brad, or I believe Stephen may be speaking directly right now. Thank you.
We'll go right to Stephen.
Thanks very much, Brad, and it's a great privilege for me to be able to give a few thoughts here in this very important arena for USAID. So I want to first quickly address why this kind of study is important to us, to underscore some things Claire said. Inclusive economic growth is really central to how USAID thinks about and does development most broadly. So at the agency, we're committed to political, economic, and social inclusion, both as intrinsic rights and also, we believe, as drivers of economic development, both at the individual and household level and for the economy as a whole. Now, except in the area of gender, there's almost no cross-country research on the inclusion of marginalized populations and economic productivity. So this is a path-breaking piece of work here on the relation between LGBT legal rights and economy-wide income in emerging market countries. I should say there's almost no research outside of the advanced countries. And this work, therefore, is really critically important, and we think it can be a model for similar research. In terms of how the findings are important for us, really sort of on the ground. So the study really does kind of weighs in empirically on two major fronts. One is that it frames the channels through which the exclusion and marginalization of LGBT people affects microeconomic outcomes for these very people. And understanding these patterns has implications for our programming in areas that correspond to our major development initiatives. This would be, for example, in health and education, but also in areas like workforce development that can be important in our programming in particular country contexts. In these arenas, understanding these micro patterns and impacts, I want to stress it's crucial, not just where the rights are currently weak and the costs of those weak rights need to be made more plain, but also where there's a divergence between the de jure status of LGBT people and their de facto treatment in the legal system and the economy. So I think this work also invites us to kind of push out further work on that dimension, on the actual lived experiences of LGBT people and how those relate to their legal rights. Then the second big area where the study is weighing in on is kind of coming to grips with the reality that the sum of the micro impacts, sort of mutually reinforcing, is going to be some kind of impact on productivity and income in the economy as a whole. And so the paper makes a strong argument that discrimination undermines the gains from specialization in trade and from investment in human capital. And when this pattern affects an appreciable share of the population, either as the targets of exclusionary norms or as the witting or unwitting enforcers of these norms in costly ways, the paper is making the argument that productivity suffers. And it documents a strong, robust correlation between LGBT legal rights and GDP per capita, both across emerging market economies and over time within emerging market economies. So this argument taken as a whole, while it leaves very deep, difficult issues about causality I'll talk about very briefly, it is making the argument that LGBT equality is not just about rights, but as Claire underscored, it's about development. So let me just touch a few very, very quick ideas about extensions, ideas for subsequent research. One, the data that underlies this study is a crucial and important contribution of its own, and more data on legal status and on the lived experiences of LGBT people is really critical. And I think there's tremendous scope for this study shows how those data can leverage up our understanding in these areas. Number two, I think there may be scope for developing the micro-macro bridge analytically, as opposed to going exclusively relying on cross-country regression evidence. So this would depend on taking the micro-evidence, crossing it with some judgments about the number of LGBT people in context, and then having a model that will enable to trace out general equilibrium interactions. Last point. When we think about economy-wide impacts, we confront the fact that economics is not an experimental science. So causality is extremely difficult, and the paper is very upfront and clear about this. Hard to know whether income is driving exclusion, exclusion is driving income, or both of them are driven by third factors that may have some independent historical and cultural roots, like secularization, for example. At some level, we need to just continue to press on and try to find sources of variation in rights that are quasi-experimental in nature. And so I just underscore how difficult that is, I'd suggest turning to the gender literature, where there's a big literature and lots of attempts to try to get reliable identification. One angle, for example, is to try to get data that is subnational and that has variation in legal rights by subnational units like states or cities, where those comparisons allow you to control for a whole bunch of other unobserved features that are common across the national space and allow you to tease out causality a little more competently. I'm going to stop there. This is terrific work. It's important for us, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Claire and Stephen. And now we're going to turn to Kay Swaldijk, who's going to present some of this great new research.
Thank you, Brad. Hi, everyone. Speaking from the Netherlands. It was a great chance to combine the research I've been doing over several years now with the economic insights and skills of Lee and her colleagues. The world, as you know it. The world is very varied. This is an effort by Wikipedia to get a sense of how varied the world is in legal terms. And this map only shows how far countries are with decriminalizing homosexuality and how far they are with recognizing couples. The whole notion of anti-discrimination protections is not even included in this very colorful map. But that's just a map. What I've been doing is to try to quantify the legal situation in all countries of the world, all independent countries of the world. And so far I have sometimes tentative legal data for all years since 1961 on an 8-point scale. I have given 2 points for issues of decriminalization, 2 points for issues of anti-discrimination protection, and 4 points for partnership recognition. Of course, it would be wonderful to have a more comprehensive index to include more de jure indicators for countries, and it would be even more fantastic to have real data on lived experience of how people are affected by the law, how people are using the law, but that would take a lot of more research. Anyhow, the 8 things I've included are here. So there's legality of gay sex and lesbian sex, then whether equal age limits apply, whether discrimination has been prohibited in employment, whether discrimination has been prohibited for the provision of goods and services, and then whether there's any recognition of de facto couples, of registered partnerships, civil unions, then whether adoption is possible or marriage. So typically 8 issues. Quite a few countries would do them in this order, but there are variations to that. This index in this graph here, on the vertical axis you see the legal index with the 8 points. I'm now showing Asia and Europe and the countries that we included in the study. Now you see what happened since 1961. As some countries had decriminalized already, others were about to do so. In the 60s, you see some economic development. GDP is on the horizontal axis. And then it's only in the 80s really that things start to change a lot. We get data for more countries. I can speed it up a little bit. No, not when it's going. But you see countries here like Nepal and Pakistan, it was fully criminalized. Even in the 80s, Bulgaria there. China, Indonesia, on the other hand, they already decriminalized it for a bit. Poland, Taiwan. Then we have more countries, sort of in Europe, Russia, Czech Republic. Still a very stable situation. But then in the 90s, speeded up also by the European Union, by the human rights legislation, more things start to happen, as you will see soon. It's really in a long, so then Hungary has anti-discrimination legislation, Czech Republic has anti-discrimination legislation, and some partnership recognition getting there. So they get more points. And you see there is a correlation. It's typically the richer countries are having more legal recognition, and the countries with more legal recognition are richer. It goes both ways. Taiwan is another example. So the correlation is much there. And if we add here, this is almost where it is. So for here we have economic data. If we add Africa and America, the same thing has happened. And even more extremely, you see outliers of South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, where the legal developments are pretty strong. And the GDP is sort of average. So this is the total picture you get when you combine the legal index with the GDP. This is the 39 countries we used in the study. If we, these are the countries we did not include in the study. So basically the poorer countries and the richer countries. But overall, there's a really strong correlation, which, as Stephen was talking about, the causality is we can't prove that. But yeah, there's different. The causality could go either way. Lee will talk more about that. Is also it seems that the things are reinforcing each other, and probably that will be my guess. It's also reinforcing, since both indicators are very much linked to public opinion. And of course the law helps public opinion and public opinion helps the law to develop. And similar with the economics. So that is roughly, I can show you in a quicker so that you have a 30 seconds. This is the whole development of the last 50 years, all countries of the world. First, the differences between countries that still criminalize and countries that have already decriminalized. And then gradually in the 80s, some countries, the richer countries, and in the 90s also few middle-income countries, they start to increase legal recognition. And presumably there's an effect the other way. South Africa is a complete outlier because of its history, its constitution. And Japan is an outlier on the other edge, where there is the economic is way ahead of the legal recognition. How about that? Everyone?
From the Williams Institute is Lee Badgett. Sir.
Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be for everybody. I am very happy to talk about this project, which we completed and published last fall. I think as you get a sense from cases, really amazing visualization, we had an opportunity to take that data and ask a new question that is complementary to the human rights framework, but really focuses much more on inclusion and economic development. So Stephen and Case have kind of already set this up, so I'm not going to say too much more about this, but actually if we could, don't see the slides. There we go. All right, Lauren, if we could go to the next one, please. So these are our big questions. We've actually got two, as Stephen hit at. One is a more macro approach where we ask whether these countries that are more inclusive of LGBT people are more economically successful. And we'll talk about the flip side of that to ask whether exclusion of LGBT people hinders economic development. We can call that the cost of homophobia or transphobia. And that's more of a micro level approach. So I'm going to start with the macro side. On the next slide, please. We have really a data shortage in this area, let's just say, and that's putting it mildly. We don't have the kind of data that we would need to compare the lived experiences of LGBT people or actual experiences of inclusion or exclusion across countries. This is a very difficult situation to face. Outside of the UK, Canada, and the US, there have not been there's not been a lot of work to create good data on those experiences. So we're hopeful that someday that will be different. But right now, the only thing we have available to compare is Cases Index, which he calls the Gilrow. We have that going back to the 1960s. I'll say something about we basically, because not much happened until the 1980s amongst these countries, we start our analysis in 1990. Because it doesn't capture the rights and experiences of transgender people, we drew on another data set that I'll tell you about in just a second. So our measures of economic development in the report were GDP per capita and the Human Development Index. For purposes of time, I'm just going to talk about the GDP per capita findings. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see the main question that we asked was, if we took that correlation that Case showed you between GDP per capita and the Gilrow, and we took into account all the other things that we know in economics influence GDP per capita, will we still see an effect? And the answer to that is yes. We still see a positive correlation even after we've controlled for population employment, capital stock, international trade, levels of education, and what are known as country and year fixed effects. So taking into account the things that we can observe by looking within countries, in essence, and looking at changes over time. So even after we do that, we find this very strong correlation that remains for GDP per capita, and it translates very loosely into one additional right being associated with a $320 increase of higher GDP per capita. For the countries that we were studying, these 39 emerging economies, that's about 3% of GDP. So I'm saying this very carefully because, as Stephen has noted, this is a correlation. We're not saying that adding one additional right will necessarily directly lead to this, but I'll come back to that question of causation at the end. So if we could go to the next slide. We asked a couple of additional questions about the data that I'll just tell you about. One possibility is that we're seeing this correlation because those countries with higher GDP are also maybe more inclusive of women, and if that goes together with more inclusion of LGBT people, maybe we're capturing the wrong thing. So we were able to find a comparable measure across time and countries in the women's share of parliament seats. So once the women's share of parliament seats is higher, we're assuming that by definition that countries are more inclusive of women. When we put that into our models, our regression models, we didn't actually see any change in the impact of the GILRO. It was still about the same size. It was still positive. So I don't think we're picking up differences in gender equity. Next slide, please. The second thing we did was to pick apart the index a little bit to say, well, is the impact of decriminalization the same as the impact of non-discrimination laws? And we compared those impacts and found that actually the decriminalization of homosexuality was not associated with a significant difference in GDP per capita. But non-discrimination laws were actually associated with a very big increase in GDP per capita, much bigger than the overall index. And having this non-discrimination law was associated with about $1,700 more in GDP per capita. So this is not to say that decriminalization doesn't matter. Usually that is a pre-existing step before non-discrimination laws are passed. We don't really know very much about how actively laws that criminalize homosexuality are enforced. So it may be that that's one reason why they don't appear to make a big difference. But it does suggest that picking these things apart is maybe important for understanding what some of the dynamics are. We did not look at the effect of rights for partners, for same-sex partners, because they were very uncommon within this particular sample of countries. Next slide, please. So those were all rights related to homosexuality. We took Transgender Europe's survey, which they called Transrespect versus Transphobia Worldwide. They asked a bunch of experts about 16 different trans-related rights for 58 countries. This is for just one point in time, however, so it's quite different from Cases Index, where he goes back. We have lots of data for different years. So we can't really do the same kind of analysis that we did for the GILRO. But the next slide will show you that, in fact, when we turn this into an index, kind of a numerical index, next slide, please, there is also a positive correlation. So I've arranged this a little bit differently from CASE. So the Transgender Rights Index is on the horizontal axis, and the GDP per capita is on the vertical axis here. And when you kind of plot out the points, you can see that there's still a pretty clear positive correlation between this index and GDP per capita in 2011. Let's see. So next slide, please. Now this raises the big question that Stephen has and Case have both alluded to, which is, is this something that we can say is causal? Does LGBT inclusion cause economic development changes, positive changes, or as countries develop, are they more likely to include LGBT people? And there is certainly a line of research and theories from political science that suggest that as countries become richer and they are less concerned about subsistence and are growing fast enough so that individuals are thinking about other kinds of aspects of democracy and the good life, that countries will be more likely to respect individual autonomy as they grow, that they will be more likely to respect the rights of minority groups, and in this particular case, that they will be more likely to respect the rights of LGBT people. So it could be that the causation is going the other way. There aren't any studies that I know of that actually demonstrate this for actual laws and inclusion. Some of the political science literature suggests that attitudes towards LGBT people, or at least attitudes towards homosexuals, are related to levels of economic development. But I think my reading of a couple of recent studies suggests that actually political factors and political differences among countries might be much more important for predicting how those changes in attitudes are translated into legal rights. So that's an open question for further research, clearly. We're positing, as Stephen noted, a different causal direction, mainly through the idea that as more people, LGBT people, are included, that they will be able to reach their fuller economic potential. They're more likely to invest in the kinds of human capital that make economies grow, and that's a type of connection that suggests that maybe at least part of this relationship, this positive correlation, is a causal one in that direction. We turn to the microsite to explore this a little bit more. We reviewed as much evidence as we could find for these 39 countries about the actual barriers, the evidence of exclusion of LGBT people in these countries. And we found, as the next slide will show, that there's actually quite a lot of evidence that there are experiences of exclusion ranging from arrests and harassment by police to violence, health disparities, job loss and discrimination in the workplace, as well as discrimination and harassment in schools. And we know from other studies of economic development that these are connected to the individual level outcomes in the middle of these slides that are all factors that tend to reduce economic output. So we do see at the micro level lots of evidence of exclusion. We know from other research and from kind of economic understandings of the connection of those factors to the individual level outcomes that they can actually add up to the larger economy-wide level outcome. So turning to the very last slide, I think, given our interest in sort of establishing, the extent to which there is some kind of causal link, it suggests that there are many opportunities for existing research, some of them with existing data. We could use other kinds of outcomes that might be easier to tie in a causal level, whether that's tourism or foreign direct investment, growth rates. We can study more countries, as Case alluded to, shown you some that basic positive correlation persists even as we add more countries to our data. And maybe there will be some opportunities within specific countries as they do collect data, which is happening very gradually and around the world, to do the kind of study that Stephen was talking about, where we can explore variation within countries and see if that's connected to economic development. But I think we are going to have to think very hard about developing new sources of data to capture the lived experiences of LGBT people in ways that we can compare across countries. And I think that's a much larger question, but it should be on our agenda to think about building a research infrastructure that can provide that kind of data, that can create the kind of researchers who can study that and use it productively within these countries as well. And that should be something important for us to think about in the future. So I'll stop with that. we have some.
Great, thanks, Lee, and thanks to all our speakers. You can silently hear almost 100 people on our line cheering for you. But at this point, we're going to turn it over to Lauren, who is going to help us take your comments and questions.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you to all our speakers. So if any of you have questions and you're signed in online, please chat in the chat box with either your question, if it's a simple one to write out, and if not, if you would like to say your question aloud, please put the phone number that you're calling from, and then I'll unmute you, and then you'll have a chance to speak, and then we'll put you back on mute just so there's not as much confusion in terms of audio. So you can go ahead and start typing up those questions and putting them in. Lee, I also wanted to ask you, would you be okay with us putting your slides or sharing your slides with the folks who are joining us today?
Yes, that's fine.
All right. So Lee's and Case's slides will be available, and Case's visualization, unfortunately, is not online, so we won't be able to share that. But we'll also be able to share the video of the webinar afterwards as well, so you can see it again. All right. And
I see one question about El Salvador.
All right. Do you want to go ahead?
Well, indeed, the data that Penn has about GDP in El Salvador are ridiculously low. So I kept them out of my visualization since they're off the scale. I don't know what's wrong there. It's a poor country, but not the poorest of the world. So, yeah, some has to be looked in too. Thank you.
Yeah, I could just say El Salvador is one of the situations where the data that we're using, the Penn World data, is designed to adjust for all sorts of differences in countries and levels, in inflation, and also several other kinds of things that make data incomparable. So they've tried to adjust for those, and El Salvador is one of those countries where those adjustments made a really big difference. So you're not completely sure why that's true, but changing that wouldn't really change the outcomes of our models.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So our next question is from Marina. She asks, was this at all focused on trans rights?
Well, my legal index is not, since it's very difficult to get legal data for so many countries going back decades on when exactly trans rights were being recognized. So that's why the other thing that Lee talked about, the Trans Rights Index, that's a snapshot based on a survey among activists and experts of how the situation was in some countries. So, as usual, less data on trans rights even than we have on sexual orientation.
Lee, did you have anything to add on that one?
No.
Gotcha. We have a question from Ryan. I want to know what is being done to incorporate the years of research that the public health sector has developed in relationship to these issues, and how they can be integrated into the current research.
Yeah, I could say something about that. I think that there are lots of things that we can learn from the public health data. But I think a lot of the public health data has focused on the HIV epidemic. And so the targets of research have been MSMs, men who have sex with men, and to a certain extent transgender women. And sometimes that research separates out those two groups, and sometimes it doesn't. And so for those groups, we actually, in a lot of countries, I think, do have some data that we could do more with in terms of assessing what the economic costs are of exclusion of LGBT people. And actually I did that. I used that data a lot for a study I did for the World Bank. But again, the downside is that it leaves a lot of people out. But it does show very conclusively that there are lots of MSMs. When you look at prevalence rates across countries, they are generally fairly comparable. It shows that there are health disparities related to HIV, but also related to the research often looks at other kinds of health conditions, mental health and physical health conditions, and shows health disparities between MSMs and transgender women and the general population. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think we could learn a lot from how that research infrastructure got developed, because people weren't really doing research on MSMs, I think, until the HIV epidemic came along. We didn't even have that term until the HIV epidemic came along. So I do think there is a lot that we could learn and incorporate.
This is Steve. I just wanted to add to that the HIV arena is also one where there's been a lot of economy-wide modeling of impacts, and so that literature might be one that could be used in our applications here.
Gotcha. All right. The next question we have is from Grace. Grace says, I am a recent college graduate looking to involve myself in policy change related to economic development for LGBTQ and female minorities. What outlets do you suggest pursuing?
Sorry, Lee, I don't get the question, but it may be my English. You get it?
Yeah, so if you wanted to work on these issues related to development, what would that look like, I guess? Maybe one way to think about that question. I think that there are, in most countries, there are LGBT rights movements who are working for human rights that might be places to plug in, because another way to think about what we're talking about here is that, recognition and respect for human rights of LGBT people is, the door opening in terms of inclusion. And I think maybe for more professional opportunities, that might be a better question for Stephen or for Claire.
Right. I think the U.S. government is a great place to work, and it, certainly if you want to get involved at the policy level. I also think that there are multilateral development organizations such as the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank or the African Development Bank, and some think tanks as well. So on the policy side, I would look to those sorts of entities to get a job. And I've been here just a couple years, and I've found it to be an incredible experience.
Gotcha. All right, and the next question, this one is for Lee. What measures have you used to measure other related issues about gender, health, etc.?
I'm not sure. In the gender development arena, there are lots of different measures that people have used, looking at the wage gaps for women, or differences in educational attainment, or the presence of domestic violence or interpersonal violence. So those are other kinds of measures of inclusion or exclusion that have been used to look for correlations with economic development. In terms of this other study for the World Bank that I mentioned, the health data was a big piece of it. I was doing this as a case study of India, so I did find some differences in prevalence of different kinds of health conditions like depression, suicidal ideation, as well as HIV, and looked for differences in employment outcomes. I could find evidence of discrimination, but not good ways to compare employment outcomes for LGBT people and non-LGBT people. There's a little bit of evidence on educational differences. So, for example, India actually collected data on what they called third gender people in their last census. I think there's some concerns about the quality of that data and where everyone was captured, but they did find 500,000 people who identified with a third gender category rather than male or female, and among those individuals, compared to the general population, there were much lower rates of education. So I think there certainly are hints from existing data that the issue of exclusion is a big one for many LGBT people in many countries.
There's also a strand within the gender literature that looks at the differential experience of women and men when there are economic shocks to the community. And you need good survey data, obviously, where people are identified, and that's way harder in the LGBT space, but it does suggest that as soon as we start getting some survey data that's disaggregated by LGBT status or self-identification, there's going to be lots of dimensions that the data might reveal how exclusion matters and how it might get particularly acute when there's a drought or some kind of macroeconomic shock, for example.
Can I meanwhile thank Maria Fontanelle for highlighting the new labor code in Santa Lucia? I didn't know that. So Santa Lucia goes up 1 point in the GILRO, and it's another country where anti-discrimination legislation is passed before decriminalization. And it seems this happened also in Botswana, Mozambique, South Africa, in fact, countries where decriminalization is really complicated. It may be easier to start with anti-discrimination. Thank you.
All right, and our next question is from Stephanie. Stephanie, we'd like to get an example of a case study or an ongoing program in job training for LGBTI groups.
Is that related? There are case studies. Well, the Williams Institute published a Nepal study, an India thing that Lee worked on, but of in-job training, I would not know.
USAID is. Sorry, Lee, go for it, and then I'll.
No, you should go. You should go.
No. I just wanted to say that as part of our, this is Claire at USAID, as part of our LGBT Global Development Partnership, we are working with the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce globally in these partnership countries to actually foster LGBT entrepreneurship. USAID is a big supporter of entrepreneurship, and so we're doing a lot of work with providing technical assistance, toolkits, Google toolkits, and then also some supply chain work, getting LGBT companies hooked in with international and also local supply chains. And that's the way that USAID has found it really works with economic empowerment globally.
Got it. Thank you. The next question is from Nicholas. Does the GILRO have any predictive modeling in it? At what point in time are some of the countries discussed? At what point in time do they get to 6 points or 8 points?
Well, the trend is predictive, but for specific countries you can't. But typically, but then again, that's looking at GILRO as a result of other developments, yeah? To predict economic development in the light of it, GILRO is almost impossible for a country. But countries that move up beyond the 8,000, 10,000 GDP, they tend to go beyond 4 or 5 points of the legal index, but not all of them. So it's very difficult to say. It's a bit more predictive if you compare it, as I've done in other slides, with public opinion. So once sort of half the population is okay with having gays as neighbors, homosexuals, as the question is, as neighbors, then countries start to have all kind of legal rights. So yeah, a little answer.
Gotcha. All right. And then our last question before we wrap up is from Jean-Sebastien. To what extent do you think that other factors such as religion can have an impact on the exclusion of LGBT people, which could also have an impact on economic development?
Well, this is Lee. I would say it's certainly likely that it has an impact on the level of the GILRO, for example, because we know that religiosity affects attitudes towards LGBT people. But how that plays out in different countries, I think, is complicated potentially, and so we could kind of think about that at a global level, but looking at it at individual countries would be important. As Case kind of alluded to, if we turn the GILRO into an outcome measure, then we can actually explore some of those kinds of questions, and we are talking about a potential project that would do that.
There's also some related work that USAID has been sponsoring at UNC that's looked at these same questions, but focused down on Latin America and the Caribbean. And there, it's really quite interesting. They do argue that the religious dimensions are important, and that they're a little bit complicated, so that even the distinction between majority Catholic populations and populations with a large share of evangelicals is predictive for LGBT rights measures. So I certainly agree with Lee that there's quite strong evidence that attitudes towards religion and cultural norms are really important in this domain, and it's really worth trying to control for those if possible when trying to disentangle the independent effect of rights on economic development.
Great, thank you so much. So that concludes our Q&A session. We have a number of questions still, so what we're going to do is we're going to write down the answers to all of your questions and then email out to all of the attendees the answers, as well as the answers to the questions that were already asked and responded to today. So Brad, you can help close this out.
Yes, thanks, Lauren, for setting up everything with the call, and I want to thank all of the speakers, Claire, Stephen, Lee, and Case, for your great presentations, as well as USAID for partnering with us on this work. And thanks to all of you. Again, we can't all cheer because there's over 100 of us, but we're happy that you could join us this morning, and we invite you to visit our website at williamsinstitute.law.ucla.edu, or if that's too much, you can just Google us and you'll find us, to keep on track of exciting new research like you heard today. So thanks, everyone, and enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.